It's really a question about whose land is this? Is this the state of Oklahoma? Do we have jurisdiction? Or is this carved up into, 6 or 7 different reservations in eastern Oklahoma?
Should some Native Americans be exempt from paying state income tax? The state's highest court will soon hear arguments on just that.
KOCO sat down with Governor Kevin Stitt to talk about a push for what he calls tax fairness.
We can't have 2 sets of rules based on your race.
It's not the duty of these indigenous nations to surrender their sovereignty to fund the state of Oklahoma.
Alicia Strobel, the woman at the center of a case against the Oklahoma Tax Commission, is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. She lives in Okmulgee, a part of Oklahoma that was reaffirmed as Indian country in the 2020 Supreme Court case, McGirt versus Oklahoma. Strobel is employed by the Muskogee Creek Nation. And following the McGirt ruling, she filed a state tax exemption claiming tribal income. To qualify for the exemption, a person must be a tribal citizen, must live within that tribe's boundaries, and must work for that tribe. The Oklahoma Tax Commission does not dispute that Strobel is a tribal citizen who works for the Muskogee Creek Nation, but the issue of the case lies in who has jurisdiction in civil matters within tribal boundaries.
The United States Supreme Court, they did confine the holding, I suppose, to criminal matters. But when you look at it, I think everybody knew right then that it could eventually, the way it was written, be expanded.
This tax exemption is not a new concept. Tribal citizens across Oklahoma who meet this criteria have legally been able to file for these long before the McGirt ruling. But what is new is what is now defined as Indian country in Oklahoma.
You can't possibly tell me that Tulsa, Oklahoma, after 116 years, is now all of a sudden not part of the state of Oklahoma.
The McGirt ruling affirmed that nearly 40% of Oklahoma is actually Indian country. Expanding the number of people who live within the boundaries of a tribal nation, the state fears this will lead to an even larger number of tax exemption filings.
I think the Supreme Court's going to do the right thing, but if they don't, then you're going to see a lot more than 1,400 people applied not to pay their taxes.
But is this a valid fear? Before the McGirt ruling, there was an average of nearly 1,500 annual filings with the Oklahoma Tax Commission claiming this exemption. In the years following the McGirt ruling, those numbers jumped to nearly 2,400 a year. But that does not mean that a ruling in Strobel's favor won't open the gates to even more filings. In a 2020 report, the Oklahoma Tax Commission estimated the filings could impact the state's revenue by as much as $73 million each year. The state argued that the impacts of a Strobel win would go even beyond revenue.
Is this truly a reservation? Well, if it is, then Oklahomans have bigger issues to face. It is true that an Indian on the Navajo reservation doesn't pay taxes to the state of Arizona. That's true. But what's also true that I'm trying to explain to people is the state of Arizona, their highway patrol doesn't patrol the reservation. They don't build roads or schools or hospitals or airports because it's not their land.
The Cherokee Nation told KOCO in part, the matters being litigated in Strobel are specifically around a small scope of tribal citizens living and working on their own tribe's reservation for the tribal government. We shouldn't be taking the governor's disproportionate predictions of disaster if the court follows the law on this as the full picture. Gary Batten, the chief of the Choctaw Nation, previously told KOCO he would be open to negotiating a compact with the state if Strobel were to win the case.
We could have just said, we don't pay anything at all. But why would we want to do that as fellow Oklahomans? Again, we drive on the same streets. We drive on our kids attend the same schools.
But Governor Stitt says he's not interested in that type of compact.
Is not something that I would do as governor.
In September, Stitt asked the legislature to pass a trigger law that would exempt all Oklahomans from paying state income tax if Strobel were to win, a request that was unsuccessful.
If Strobel wins the day and they don't have to pay taxes, then nobody should pay taxes. And we'll have to deal with the revenue that we do have. I'm not going to be a governor of a state where one race pays and another race doesn't.
Oklahoma's tribal nations contributed more than $15 billion to the state's economy in 2019, employing both native and non-native Oklahomans.
They are huge employers of the general population here. And so, they're economic powerhouses that help fund the state otherwise.
A Strobel win would reaffirm tribal nation sovereignty in civil matters.
If the nation's rights are reaffirmed in this way, they have more opportunities to generate revenue for themselves, to fund programs, and then also to put back into the state of Oklahoma.
And highlight the need for a harmonious relationship between the tribes and the state.
So I want to have a great relationship. But I will be very resolute, and I'll just tell Oklahomans, and I told them during the campaign, I will not give my state away. I'm not going to give away our land or jurisdiction or our tax revenue. I'm going to treat everybody exactly the same.
And I think a lot of these leaders of these nations, they are otherwise willing to work with the state government, but not under these terms where you have a governor and state officials literally trying to impose, unilaterally what they want.
Chapman's sentiment was something that was echoed in a meeting between state lawmakers and tribal leaders last week.
We're going to get a lot more done if we simply work together. The state's going to benefit, the tribes are going to benefit, and one doesn't need to try to get it over on the other one.
So the state Supreme Court actually gave Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond a deadline of November 1st to weigh in on the case. It's something he actually declined to do. Arguments from both parties, both sides, are scheduled for January 17th. Of course, this is a state Supreme Court case that we will be following very closely.